When I moved to Ashfield, Oregon, I told myself this was going to be a fresh start. After years of cramped apartments and noisy neighbors, I finally had my own place. A modest, single-story house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The air was crisp, clean, and carried the scent of pine from the dense forests that surrounded the town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my evenings unpacking, fixing up the yard, and getting used to the eerie silence that came with living alone. My nearest neighbor was a retired couple 2 houses down, friendly but mostly kept to themselves. The house directly next to mine had been empty since I arrived until one Saturday morning, a moving truck rumbled down the street and pulled into the driveway. That's when I first saw him. He stepped out of the truck with heavy boots, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a thick grizzled beard and a face that had seen years of hard labor. His eyes were dark, deep-set, and unreadable. He carried himself like a man who was used to working with his hands, used to being in control. I was standing on my porch when he looked up and saw me. I raised a hand in a casual wave, offering the kind of neighborly greeting you'd expect in a town like this. But he didn't wave back. He just stood there, staring, his expression blank. A few seconds later, he turned and walked inside, shutting the door behind him without a word. Something about that first interaction unsettled me. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just tired from the move, or maybe he wasn't the friendly type, but something about the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up, made my stomach knot. The first real conversation I had with him happened 2 weeks later. I was out in the yard, trimming the overgrown hedges along the fence line, when I felt eyes on me. I looked up and sure enough, there he was, standing on his porch, arms crossed, watching me. I hesitated before forcing a smile. "Hey there," I called out, trying to sound friendly. "How's it going?" He didn't respond right away. He just kept staring, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, after what felt like too long a pause, he finally spoke. "You live alone?" His voice was low and gravelly, like he'd smoked a pack a day for years. The question caught me off guard. I blinked, my grip tightening on the hedge trimmer. Yeah, just me." He nodded slowly, like he was filing the information away. "That's good," he muttered. "Easier that way." I let out a nervous chuckle, not sure how to respond. Before I could think of anything, he turned and walked back inside, shutting the door behind him. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I exhaled. From that point on, things got weirder. At first, it was small things. I'd come home from work and find my garbage cans knocked over, even though there hadn't been any wind. My garden hose, which I always coiled neatly, would be stretched out across the yard. I told myself it was just animals. That's what I wanted to believe. But then, one evening, I stepped outside to lock up for the night and saw him standing at the edge of my property, just beyond the glow of the porch light. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at my house. I froze, my hand tightening around the doorknob. "Hank?" I called out. No response. He stood there for another few seconds, then turned and walked back toward his house without a word. I barely slept that night. A few nights later, I woke to a loud crash outside my bedroom window. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sat up, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through my yard. I scrambled out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my nightstand. My hands were slick with sweat as I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. Hank was standing next to my car. He was facing it, his body tense, his hands clenched at his sides. Then, in one swift motion, he lifted something over his head and smashed it against my windshield. Glass exploded outward, shards scattering across the driveway. I jerked back from the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. "You can't hide from me," Hank bellowed, his voice echoing through the night. I didn't think. I just grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. By the time the cops arrived, Hank was gone. They found nothing. No sign of him, no footprints. Nothing but the shattered glass and my rattled nerves. I told them what had happened, described Hank, but the officer just sighed and shrugged. "Without proof that he did it, there's not much we can do," he said. Might be a good idea to invest in some security cameras. Security cameras. Like that would make me feel any safer. I knew then that I had to leave. The next morning, I put the house on the market. I didn't care about losing money. I didn't care about the hassle of moving. I just knew I couldn't stay. For the next few weeks, I did everything I could to avoid Hank. I stopped spending time in the yard, kept my blinds shut, and never went outside after dark. But even with the curtains drawn, I could feel him watching. One night, I heard movement outside my bedroom window again. My stomach twisted into knots, but I didn't look. I didn't want to see him standing there. The house sold faster than I expected. A young couple, excited about their first home, signed the papers within a month. I didn't warn them about Hank. I didn't say a word. As I pulled out of the driveway for the last time, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Hank was standing on his porch, watching me leave. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. And I knew, deep down, I hadn't escaped him. Not really, because even now, in my new home, I still find myself looking over my shoulder. Still wondering if one night, I'll wake up to find him standing outside my window again. They say when you move into a new neighborhood, you should always make an effort to get to know your neighbors. After my experience with Hank Grayson in Ashfield, Oregon, I can tell you, sometimes it's better not to know them at all. I learned that the hard way, and I'm not the only one. I moved away, started fresh again, but the fear followed me like a shadow. I'd sit by my window at night and catch myself expecting to see Hank standing there, watching. Even in my new place, hundreds of miles away, the paranoia lingered. I joined an online support group for people who'd had disturbing encounters with neighbors. That's where I met Sarah Carter. Her story made my own nightmare look tame. She and her husband Ben moved to Stonebridge, Colorado, hoping for the same thing I'd wanted, a peaceful home, a fresh start. What they got was anything but. Sarah told me it all started the day they moved in. It was late April when they arrived at the little house on Pine Grove Lane, a fix-upper with a charming wraparound porch and a yard just big enough to start a garden. They were exhausted from the move when the doorbell rang. Sarah opened it to find an elderly woman standing there, holding a steaming casserole dish. "Welcome to the neighborhood, dear," the woman chirped. Her smile stretched across her wrinkled face like it had been practiced in a mirror. "I'm Edith Crawley, lived next door for over 30 years. Thought you could use a hot meal after all that unpacking." Sarah hesitated. The casserole smelled delicious, and the woman seemed friendly enough, but something about her eyes put Sarah on edge. They were a little too wide, a little too bright. She glanced at Ben, who smiled politely and thanked Edith. As Edith handed over the dish, she leaned in close to Sarah. "If you ever need anything, just knock," she said, her voice soft and almost conspiratorial. "I'm always watching." Sarah gave a nervous laugh. "You mean watching out for us, right?" Edith's smile faltered for a split second. "Of course, dear. Watching out for you." The casserole was delicious, chicken and mushroom with a flaky crust. But Edith's comment stuck with Sarah long after dinner was over. The next morning, Sarah went outside to water the plants they'd brought from their old apartment. She was bent over the flower bed when she heard the creak of a screen door. She looked up to see Edith standing on her porch, watching her. Sarah forced a smile and waved. Edith smiled back, but didn't move. She just stood there, eyes fixed on Sarah's every movement. When Sarah went back inside, she locked the door. At first, Sarah tried to rationalize it. Edith was just an old woman who lived alone, probably lonely and curious about her new neighbors. But Edith's presence became constant. Every time Sarah or Ben went outside, Edith was there. Morning, afternoon, evening, it didn't matter. She'd watch from her porch or peek through her lace curtains. And she always had advice to offer. "The soil here's tricky," she called out one morning while Sarah was planting flowers. "Don't use that fertilizer, the roses don't like it." Another time, as Ben was adjusting the satellite dish, "The wind gets bad here in the winter. Best bolt that down tight." The advice was always correct, but how did Edith know what they were doing all the time? Then the gifts started. Every few days, Edith would show up at their door unannounced. Freshly baked cookies, old gardening tools, magazines from decades ago. One evening, just as Sarah and Ben were sitting down for dinner, the doorbell rang. Sarah opened the door to find Edith standing there, holding a plate of brownies. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. "Thought you might have a sweet tooth," Edith said. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawley, but we're just sitting down for dinner." Edith's smile remained frozen in place. "I know," she whispered. I saw the lights go on. Sarah and Ben decided to set boundaries. They were polite but firm, telling Edith they appreciated her kindness but needed more privacy. Edith just nodded and smiled, though the warmth in her eyes seemed to drain away. For a few days, things were quiet. Then, Sarah started noticing odd things around the house. The mail was rearranged on the kitchen counter. The bathroom mirror, which she always wiped down after showering, was fogged up with faint streaks. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming, even with the blinds shut tight. One night, as they watched TV, Sarah glanced at the bookshelf and frowned. A small, black object was tucked behind the books. She stood and pulled it out. It was a tiny, outdated camera. She turned it over in her hands, her heart racing. "Ben," she whispered. He jumped up from the couch. "Is that?" Sarah nodded. They began tearing through the house. They found 2 more cameras, one in the bedroom vent, another in the bathroom light fixture. Sarah collapsed onto the couch, shaking. "She's been watching us." Ben stormed over to Edith's house while Sarah called the police. Edith opened her door before he even knocked. "Ah, Benjamin," she said sweetly. "Something wrong? You've been spying on us," he shouted. "We found your cameras." Edith tilted her head. "Spying? No, just keeping you safe." Her voice wavered slightly, and her smile stretched wider. "The world's dangerous, you know. So many bad people out there. I had to keep an eye on you, for your own good." Ben stepped back, horrified. "You're insane." The police arrived a few minutes later. They questioned Edith and searched her house, but found no equipment, no recordings, nothing. Without evidence directly linking her to the cameras, there was nothing they could do. Sarah and Ben packed their bags that night and left for a hotel. The next morning they returned to grab a few essentials. As Sarah walked into the kitchen, she froze. On the table, in neat handwriting, was a note. "You shouldn't have done that. I only wanted to help." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. She turned and ran out of the house. They sold the house a month later. The new owners, another young couple, moved in right away. Sarah warned them about Edith, about the cameras, but they laughed it off. "Oh yeah, there's just a sweet old lady," the wife said. Sarah never went back to Stonebridge, but sometimes, late at night, she swears she can hear Edith's voice whispering in the dark. "I'm always watching." After Sarah finished telling me her story, we sat in silence for a long time. I wanted to tell her it was over now, that she was safe, but I knew better. Because once you've had a neighbor like that, the fear never leaves. You always wonder who's watching, and you never forget the feeling of being seen. I didn't sleep much after Sarah told me her story. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those tiny cameras hidden in her home, the cold smile on Edith Crawley's face as she said she was just trying to keep them safe. The thought of someone watching me, studying me, while I went about my life was suffocating. But Sarah's story wasn't the only one that haunted me. In the same online support group where I met her, I came across James Nolan. His story had the same familiar thread, a seemingly harmless neighbor who crossed lines no one should ever cross. James was younger than me, only 28 when it happened. He moved to Fairbrook, Indiana, a quiet, working-class town where people left their doors unlocked and greeted strangers with a nod. But trust, James learned, can be a dangerous thing. James moved into a small rental house on Birchwood Drive, a short dead-end street lined with modest homes and neatly trimmed lawns. The house was old but sturdy, with creaky wooden floors and a single window in the living room that overlooked the neighbor's yard. He hadn't even finished unpacking when Carl Davies showed up. Carl was in his early 50s, with thinning gray hair and a wiry build. He wore faded jeans and grease-streaked shirts, the kind of guy who probably knew every shortcut in town and could fix a car engine blindfolded. James first noticed Carl standing at the edge of his driveway, watching him unload boxes from his truck. "Need a hand?" Carl called out, flashing a crooked grin. James hesitated. Something about the way Carl tilted his head made him uneasy, but he was too polite to refuse. Sure, thanks." Carl walked over, his steps slow and deliberate. "Carl Davies," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Live next door." James shook his hand and gave a tight smile. "James Nolan, just moved in." Carl's eyes shifted to the open boxes. "Yeah, I saw you come in around 6:43 last night," he said casually. James froze. He hadn't told anyone when he'd arrived. He forced a laugh. "Yeah, something like that." Carl didn't laugh with him. He just stared for a moment, then picked up a box and carried it inside without another word. The first few weeks passed without incident, though James often saw Carl sitting on his porch, watching his house. Sometimes Carl waved, other times he just sat there, cigarette in hand, his gaze never leaving James's windows. Then came the small things. James started noticing his windows were cracked open when he was sure he'd closed them. His keys were moved from the kitchen counter to the coffee table. His mail, which he usually left unopened until the weekend, was sometimes already torn open when he retrieved it from the mailbox. He told himself he was being paranoid. He was forgetful sometimes, but the feeling that someone had been inside his home stuck like gum on his shoe. Impossible to ignore. The breaking point came one Sunday morning when James went to grab a wrench from his toolbox in the garage. The toolbox was still there, but the wrench was gone. So were the pliers and the duct tape. That afternoon, Carl strolled over while James stood in the garage trying to figure out how his tools had disappeared. "Looking for these?" Carl asked. James turned to see Carl holding the missing wrench and pliers in one hand. Yeah. Where'd you find those?" Carl shrugged. "Thought you left 'em out by the fence. Figured I'd hold on to 'em for you. Never know who might walk by and take 'em." James forced a smile. "Thanks, appreciate it." Carl handed him the tools, his eyes lingering too long on James's face. "You really gotta lock your back door, James. Can't trust people these days." James's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't mentioned his back door to Carl. That night, James double-checked every window and door, locking each one twice. He moved a heavy chair in front of the back door for good measure. The paranoia ate at him, until he finally went online and ordered a set of security cameras. The cameras arrived 2 days later. James installed them himself, placing one above the back door, one over the garage, and a third in the living room. The system synced with his phone, sending an alert whenever it detected motion. The first few nights were quiet, but on the fourth night, at 2:13 a.m., James's phone buzzed. Motion detected. Back door. His stomach dropped. He opened the app and squinted at the grainy video feed. Carl was there, standing at the back door, his hand on the handle. James's mouth went dry. Carl tested the handle, found it locked, then turned and stared directly into the camera lens. He gave a small nod, like he was acknowledging James's presence. Then he walked away. James didn't sleep that night. The police came the next morning. James showed them the footage, but Carl hadn't broken in, hadn't stolen anything. Just stood there like he owned the place. "Looks like he's testing your boundaries," the officer said. "We can talk to him, but unless he actually commits a crime, there's not much we can do." The officers spoke with Carl that afternoon. When James peeked through his curtains, Carl was standing on his porch, watching the police car drive away. His eyes flicked to James' window, and he smiled. That night, the cameras picked up more motion. 2:27 a.m. Side window. James opened the app. Carl was standing outside the bedroom window, hands pressed against the glass, his breath fogging it. His eyes were locked on the camera. James called the police again. This time they found footprints in the dirt, but Carl was back inside his own house when they arrived. They issued a formal warning. Carl waved to James as they left. The next night, James woke up to a soft click. His bedroom door. His heart jackhammered against his ribs. He reached for his phone but couldn't find it. The room was too dark. He strained to listen. The floor creaked. A shadow moved near the door. James lunged for the lamp on his nightstand and flicked it on. Carl stood at the foot of the bed, holding James's phone. "See?" Carl whispered. Told you you should lock your back door. James screamed and swung the lamp. It shattered against Carl's shoulder. Carl staggered but didn't fall. He lunged toward James just as the security alarm blared through the house. James scrambled off the bed and ran for the bathroom, slamming the door and locking it. He heard Carl cursing on the other side, then footsteps running through the house. The police arrived in minutes. They found Carl hiding in James's garage with a backpack full of duct tape, zip ties, and a hunting knife. Carl was arrested and charged with breaking and entering. The police said he'd been watching James for weeks, learning his schedule, figuring out when he was most vulnerable. They found fingerprints on the windows, the kitchen counters, even the bedroom nightstand. James moved out the next day. He lives in an apartment now, with 6 locks on the door and security cameras in every room. He told me that whenever he hears footsteps in the hallway at night, his mind still plays tricks on him. He imagines Carl standing outside the door, whispering through the crack, "You forgot to lock the back door." After hearing James's story, I stopped sleeping near windows. I double-check my locks every night now. Sometimes I even move a chair in front of the door, because once you've had someone break into your world like that, you realize something terrifying. They're never really gone. They're just waiting for you to forget. After I heard James Nolan's story about Carl Davies, I couldn't shake the image of that man standing in his bedroom, breathing, watching, clutching James's phone like it was some kind of trophy. The idea of someone knowing your schedule, your habits, and every vulnerable moment, that kind of violation doesn't just disappear when the intruder is caught. It lingers, it festers. James isn't the only one who knows that feeling. About 6 months after his ordeal, I got a message from another member of the group. Her name was Emily Stone. She lived through a different kind of nightmare. But it started the same way. A house, a neighbor, and a slow realization that someone was always watching. Emily moved to Ravenwood, Texas in the fall of 2019. She was 33, a middle school teacher who'd finally saved enough to buy her first home. The house was a modest one, strong with white siding and blue shutters, tucked away in a quiet suburb where neighbors greeted each other from their porches and kids rode their bikes until dusk. It was exactly the kind of place she'd always imagined living. The day she moved in, she stood on the front porch, coffee in hand, and admired the street. Across from her, an older man sat in a creaky rocking chair. He was thin and wiry, probably in his 60s, with a bald head and thick dark eyebrows. His chair swayed slowly, the rhythmic creak cutting through the otherwise peaceful morning. Emily smiled and gave a friendly wave. The man didn't respond. He just kept rocking, his eyes locked on her like a hunter studying prey. At first, Emily brushed it off. Maybe he didn't see her, or maybe he was just the quiet type. Plenty of people in small towns were like that, polite but private. But as the days passed, she realized the man was always there, morning, noon, night. It didn't matter. He was never there. Whenever she looked out her window or stepped onto her porch, she'd find him in his chair, watching her house. Never smiling, never waving, just watching. Her co-workers laughed when she mentioned it at lunch one day. "He's probably just bored," said Michelle, who lived a few neighborhoods over. "Old people love to sit and people wait." Emily forced a smile and nodded. Maybe Michelle was right. Still, when she got home that night and saw the man sitting there staring at her as she parked in the driveway, the familiar unease crept in. That night, she closed all the blinds before bed. The next morning, Emily opened her front door to get the newspaper and froze. There were muddy footprints on her porch. The prints were large, too large for any kid. They started at the sidewalk, stopped just shy of the front door, and then turned around. Her heart raced as she scanned the street. The man across the street was there, as usual. His rocking chair moved in its lazy, predictable rhythm. He wasn't looking at her house this time, though. He was looking directly at her. The footprints became a pattern. Every few nights, she'd wake up and find them. Sometimes near the front door, sometimes under the living room window. Once, she found them by the back patio. She called the police. An officer came out, took some pictures, and promised to keep an eye on things. But with no forced entry and no clear suspect, there wasn't much they could do. "Probably just some neighborhood kids," the officer said with a shrug. But Emily knew better. The kids in this neighborhood were small, their laughter harmless and cheerful. The person leaving those footprints was an adult, and she had a strong suspicion who it was. The man across the street. She started paying closer attention to him. His name, she learned, was Leonard Pierce. He'd lived in the house for over 20 years, alone for the last 5 after his wife passed. The neighbors said he mostly kept to himself. "He's weird, sure," said Mr. Davis from 3 doors down, "but harmless." Harmless. The word echoed in Emily's head later that night as she checked her locks for the 3rd time. The next few weeks passed in uneasy silence. Leonard was still there every day, but the footprints stopped appearing. Emily let herself believe maybe it was over. Until the note appeared. She came home from work one evening and tossed her bag on the couch. The house felt stuffy, so she opened the windows to let in some air. That's when she noticed it, a small piece of paper sitting neatly on her coffee table. She hadn't left it there. She walked over, dread coiling in her stomach. The paper was lined, like it had been torn from a notebook. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "I like your blue pajamas." Her knees buckled and she dropped the paper like it was on fire. She didn't own blue pajamas, not anymore. She'd gotten rid of them 2 months ago. Her gaze snapped toward the window. Across the street, Leonard sat in his chair. His eyes met hers, his lips curled into the faintest smile. The police came again, but there were no fingerprints on the note, no forced entry, nothing. "You should get a security system," the officer advised. She did, cameras on every corner of the house, sensors on the windows, motion-activated lights along the driveway. But the cameras didn't stop Leonard from watching. The final straw came on a cold Saturday night. Emily was grading papers in the living room when the motion detector in the backyard went off. Her phone buzzed with the notification. "Motion detected, backyard, 2:12 a.m. Her stomach flipped as she tapped the screen to view the live feed. The camera showed the backyard bathed in pale light. The patio furniture stood undisturbed. The garden hose lay coiled by the fence. Everything looked normal except Leonard stood just beyond the camera's reach, barely visible in the shadows. He was facing the house, his head tilted, his hands clasped behind his back. Then, as if sensing her eyes on him, he stepped forward into the light. His eyes locked on the camera. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed to the back door. Emily's breath caught. Leonard moved to the door, bent slightly, and pressed his forehead to the glass. His lips moved, forming words. The camera didn't have audio, but she could read his lips. "Come out, Emily. I just want to talk." She backed away from her phone, heart racing. The police arrived 10 minutes later. Leonard was gone. The officer shook his head as he surveyed the yard. "No signs of forced entry, no crime committed. We can try talking to him, but—" He trailed off with a helpless shrug. Emily didn't sleep that night, or the next. She packed a bag, booked a hotel, and put the house on the market. 2 weeks later, she drove through the neighborhood one last time. The house looked the same from the outside, just a quiet, ordinary home on a quiet, ordinary street. But when she glanced across the road, she saw Leonard standing on his porch. His eyes tracked her car as she passed, his mouth twisted into that familiar, empty smile. She left Ravenwood without looking back. Emily lives in a high-rise apartment now, with no porch, no yard, and no neighbors across the street. But she still can't shake the feeling of eyes watching her through the windows. Sometimes, she swears she hears the creak of a rocking chair from the empty unit across the hall. And sometimes, just sometimes, she finds notes slipped under her door. No handwriting, no signature, just the same 3 words, scribbled over and over again. "I see you." I don't know what's more terrifying, the idea of being watched by someone who shouldn't know you, or the realization that sometimes the watcher isn't even human. After hearing Emily Stone's story about Leonard Pierce, the man who never left his porch until he was standing in her backyard, I thought I'd heard the worst. The idea of someone so brazenly invading your life, watching you like a predator stalking prey, was horrifying enough. But Daniel Reese's story? That one made me question reality itself. 'Cause Daniel didn't have a living, breathing neighbor watching him. No, What haunted him was something older, something that didn't need doors or windows to get inside. Daniel moved to Black Hollow, Vermont in the fall of 2015. He was a freelance writer, looking for peace and inspiration away from the bustle of city life. The town was small, nestled in a valley surrounded by thick forests. His rental was an old stone cottage that sat at the edge of the woods. It was charming in a rustic, slightly eerie way, a place with history etched into its cracked walls and creaky floors. The neighbor's situation was ideal, or so Daniel thought at the time. There was only one other house nearby, an old Victorian-style home about 50 yards away. It had been empty for years, according to the landlord. The owners had long since passed, and the property was tied up in some estate battle. Daniel didn't mind. He liked the solitude. He spent his days writing and his evenings sipping coffee on the back porch, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. Then, on the third evening, he saw the figure. It was just after sunset. The woods behind his house had turned into dark silhouettes against the fading orange sky. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, enjoying the crisp autumn air, when he noticed movement by the fence line. A man stood there, tall, thin, motionless. Daniel squinted. The figure stood just beyond the reach of the porch light, so it was hard to make out any details. But it was definitely a man, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a long coat. He wasn't facing the woods, he was facing Daniel. "Hey," Daniel called out. "Can I help you?" The figure didn't respond. Daniel's pulse quickened. He glanced toward the Victorian house, wondering if the figure had come from there, but it remained dark and lifeless. "Sir," he tried again. The figure stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked back into the woods. The movement was smooth, almost gliding. Daniel's skin prickled. The next morning, Daniel walked to the fence line where the figure had stood. The ground was soft from last night's rain, but there were no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. He told himself it had been a trick of the light, maybe a passing hiker. But when the figure appeared again the next night, and the night after that, he stopped trying to rationalize it. The figure showed up every evening at dusk, standing in the exact same spot, watching him. Daniel considered calling the police, but what would he say? "There's a man standing near my fence line" wasn't exactly illegal, and he had no proof beyond his own word. Instead, he decided to confront the stranger directly. The next evening, he sat on the porch and waited. Right on schedule, the figure appeared at dusk. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and strode toward the fence. The closer he got, the heavier the air felt, like walking into a room where someone had just been arguing. When he was about 10 feet away, he lifted the flashlight and aimed it directly at the figure's face. The beam hit an empty hood. No face, no features, just an abyss of darkness where a face should have been. Daniel gasped and stumbled backward. The figure didn't move. "You need to leave," Daniel stammered. His voice sounded small against the rustling of the wind. The figure cocked its head slightly, as though considering his words. Then it stepped forward, without making a sound. The dry leaves underfoot didn't crunch, the grass didn't shift. Daniel ran back to the house and slammed the door, locking it. The figure didn't follow, but when Daniel peeked out the window an hour later, it was still standing there. The next morning, Daniel called the local sheriff. Sheriff Tom Whitaker arrived within an hour. He was a stocky, middle-aged man who looked like he'd seen more bar fights than paranormal activity. "So, you're telling me there's some shadow man loitering by your fence?" Whitaker asked, scribbling in his notebook. Daniel bristled at the tone. "I'm telling you there's someone, or something, watching me every night." Whitaker sighed and walked around the property. He found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed soil. Finally, he turned back to Daniel. "Look, Mr. Reese, this house, it's got a reputation. People talk." Daniel frowned. "What kind of reputation?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "The last guy who lived here claimed he saw someone standing by the fence too, said it was a ghost. He left after 3 months. Did you ever figure out who it was?" "Nope." Whitaker adjusted his hat. "Did you put it close?" "Folks around here think it's old Harold Green. He built that house next door in 1912. Disappeared a few years later. Never found his body." Daniel's stomach turned. Why would Harold be watching me? Whitaker shrugged. "Who knows? Some things are better left alone." Daniel spent the next day researching the property. Harold Green, it turned out, had lived in the Victorian house with his wife and young daughter. One night, the family vanished without a trace. The only clue was a single handprint on the stone fence in the backyard. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, but locals whispered about Green dabbling in the occult. Daniel found an old photograph of the family. Harold stood stiffly in the center, a stern expression on his face. His eyes were deep set beneath thick brows. His coat was long and buttoned to the collar. It was the same coat Daniel had seen on the figure. That night, Daniel decided to stay awake and watch from inside the house. He sat in the living room, lights off, phone in hand. At 6:43 p.m., the motion sensor light near the fence clicked on. The figure stood there, as always, but tonight it moved closer. Daniel's phone vibrated. Motion detected. Back porch. He glanced at the screen. The figure was standing at the back door, facing the camera. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He looked up toward the door. The figure was there, inches from the glass. No face, no features, just a void beneath the hood. It lifted a hand and tapped the glass with one long pale finger. Tap, tap, tap. The porch light flickered. The figure leaned forward, pressing what should have been its forehead against the glass. Its voice, thin and cold, whispered through the door. "Come with me." Daniel screamed and sprinted upstairs, locking himself in the bathroom. He stayed there until sunrise. When he finally emerged, the glass door was covered in pale handprints. Daniel packed a bag and left that day. The house has sat empty ever since. But, sometimes, passing drivers report seeing someone standing by the fence at dusk, a tall figure in a long coat staring at the empty house, waiting. Daniel told me all this in a hushed voice, eyes darting toward the window every few seconds. When he finished, he took a deep breath and shook his head. "You think it's gone?" I asked. His face paled. "No. It followed me." He gestured toward the window. I turned and froze. A figure stood across the street. Tall, hooded, motionless, watching us. Daniel's voice broke the silence. "It's always watching." After Daniel Reese told me about the figure by his fence, I stopped sleeping near windows. The image of that hooded figure pressing its face to the glass, whispering, "Come with me." Yeah, that one stuck with me. But Daniel's story wasn't the end. There was one more. I remember the night Olivia Grant reached out in the group chat. Her messages were short, panicked, like someone who had just run 10 blocks without stopping. "I don't know what to do. My son keeps talking about a boy next door, but the house is empty." I thought he was imagining things, but tonight, I saw him too. What Olivia and her son experienced wasn't just disturbing, it was something worse. Something you can't explain with locks and cameras. Olivia Grant moved to Maple Crest, Pennsylvania in the summer of 2022. She'd just finalized her divorce and was eager for a fresh start with her 7-year-old son, Ethan. The house they found was perfect, a cozy 2-story with a big backyard and a quiet cul-de-sac where kids rode bikes and neighbors smiled as they mowed their lawns. The house next door was different. It was old, much older than the rest of the neighborhood, with sagging shutters and a crooked chimney. The front yard was overgrown, the mailbox rusted and leaning. Olivia asked the realtor about it during the walkthrough. "That one's been empty for years," the realtor said with a dismissive wave. "Family moved out after their kid went missing, never found him. Sad story." Olivia shuddered, but brushed it off. Missing kids were a tragic reality everywhere. She wasn't about to let one story ruin their new beginning. The first time Ethan mentioned Timmy was 3 days after they moved in. "Mom, I met a friend," he said at dinner. "That's great, buddy," Olivia replied. "What's his name?" "Timmy," she smiled. "Is Timmy from school?" Ethan shook his head, spooning mashed potatoes onto his plate. "No, he lives next door." Olivia froze. "Honey, the house next door is empty." Ethan frowned. "No, it's not. Timmy lives there. He said he used to play in the basement, but he's not allowed down there anymore." That night, Olivia stood at her bedroom window, staring at the dark, lifeless house next door. The curtains in the upstairs window fluttered slightly, though there was no breeze. She closed her blinds. The next morning, Ethan was in the backyard when Olivia heard him talking. She peeked through the window. He was standing by the chain-link fence that separated their yard from the abandoned property. His head was tilted as though he were listening. "Ethan," she called, stepping outside. He jumped and turned to face her. "Who are you talking to?" she asked. "Timmy," Ethan said, as if it were obvious. "He says the man with the black hat doesn't like when we talk too much." Olivia's skin went cold. "What man with the black hat?" Ethan shrugged. "Timmy says he lives in the basement." That night Olivia did a deep dive into the town's archives. It took hours, but she found the story. The boy who disappeared from next door had been named Timothy Martin. He vanished in 1986. Search teams scoured the woods, interviewed neighbors, but found nothing. The case went cold. She dug deeper. In the 1970s and 80s, there had been a string of child disappearances across Pennsylvania, all unsolved. The police suspected a man named Harold Black Hat Briggs, a handyman who often worked near the victims' homes. He was arrested, but released for lack of evidence. A year later, Briggs vanished without a trace. His last known job, the house next door. The next morning, Olivia woke to find Ethan's toys scattered across the lawn. His favorite truck sat at the base of the fence. It was covered in dirt. She picked it up. Scratched into the plastic was a message: "Come play in the basement." Olivia rushed into the house, heart pounding. "Ethan, did you write on your truck?" He shook his head, eyes wide. "Timmy said I should come over today. He said the man in the black hat wants to meet me." Olivia grabbed Ethan's wrist. "We are not talking to Timmy anymore. Do you understand?" "But Timmy says he needs my help," Ethan whispered. That night, Olivia moved a dresser in front of his window and locked all the doors. At 2:13 a.m., she woke to Ethan's laughter. She bolted from bed and ran to his room. The window was wide open. The dresser had been shoved aside. "Ethan!" she screamed, frantically searching the room. The bed was empty. Her phone buzzed. Motion detected. Backyard. She opened the camera feed. Ethan stood by the fence. "Fugu you do!" Ethan stood by the fence, holding hands with another child. A pale boy with sunken eyes. Behind them stood a tall figure wearing a wide-brimmed black hat. The man was pointing toward the basement door of the abandoned house. Olivia sprinted outside, screaming Ethan's name. The boy in the striped shirt turned his head toward her, and she swore she saw a deep, hollow sadness in his eyes before he vanished into the ground like mist. The man in the black hat tilted his head toward Olivia, then led Ethan toward the basement door. Olivia leapt over the fence, scraping her knees raw, and charged across the yard. The basement door creaked open. "Ethan!" she screamed. Her son turned at the threshold. His face was blank, his eyes glassy. "Mommy?" His voice sounded far away. The man in the black hat tightened his grip on Ethan's wrist and smiled. His teeth were gray and uneven. His eyes were black voids. Olivia lunged and grabbed Ethan's arm just as the figure yanked him toward the basement stairs. For one heart-stopping moment, she felt the ice-cold grip of the man's hand brush hers. Then she pulled with every ounce of strength she had, wrenching Ethan away. The basement door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Olivia didn't stop running until they were locked in the car, speeding away from Maple Crest. Ethan woke the next morning in the motel, confused and groggy. He didn't remember the night before. Olivia didn't tell him. She sold the house remotely and never returned. 2 weeks later, Ethan came into the kitchen, clutching a piece of paper. "Timmy drew me a picture," he said. Olivia's heart dropped. She unfolded the paper. It showed 2 stick figures, one small, one tall. The tall figure wore a black hat. Beneath the drawing were the words, "Missed you in the basement. See you soon." I haven't heard from Olivia since she shared that story. Her phone's disconnected. Her social media accounts are gone. Sometimes, late at night, I scroll back through our old messages and read her final text. "I left the house, but I think the man in the black hat followed us. And then I close my blinds, because I swear I've seen a boy standing across the street, watching, waiting, smiling." If there's one thing these stories have taught us, it's that danger doesn't always come from distant, shadowy places. Sometimes it lives just across the street, behind a neighbor's smile, or even beneath the floorboards of the house next door. 6 stories you've just heard aren't just about terrifying encounters, they're about the fragile nature of the safety we often take for granted. Our homes are supposed to be sanctuaries, places where we can relax and let our guard down. But what happens when the threat comes from someone who knows your habits, your routines, someone who learns your vulnerabilities because they live right next door? Michael Thompson learned that not every fresh start is a safe one. Hank Grayson reminded us that some people watch with intentions far darker than curiosity. Sarah and Ben Carter discovered that kindness can sometimes be a mask for obsession. James Nolan saw firsthand how dangerous a neighbor's fixation can become. Emily Stone learned that not all watchers care if you notice them. They just want you to know that they see you. Daniel Reese was reminded that the past doesn't always stay buried, especially in places where shadows have deep roots. And Olivia Grant came face to face with a truth more terrifying than any ghost story. Children often sense the darkness long before adults do. So what can we take from these stories? First, trust your instincts. If someone or something makes you feel uneasy, don't dismiss it as paranoia. Our instincts have been sharpened over generations to detect danger. Protect your home. Install cameras, reinforce doors and windows, and pay attention to the small details. A moved garden hose, an open window, or a misplaced toy might be more than a simple accident. Third, never ignore children when they speak of imaginary friends, strange figures, or unusual events. Kids see the world with fewer filters than we do, and sometimes they notice what we can't, or refuse to, see. Lastly, remember that evil doesn't always wear a mask. It might appear as a helpful neighbor, a friendly face across the street, or an innocent child standing at the window of an abandoned house. Your safety starts with awareness. Don't live in fear. We'd love to hear your story, because sometimes the most terrifying stories aren't fiction. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the neighbor who's always watching might not just be curious. We'll see you in the next nightmare.